Hello and welcome to the Pods of War podcast, where military historians from the University of Wolverhampton discuss the history of conflict, popular culture, and just about everything else. My name is Dr. Adam Dighton, and I'm a lecturer in war studies at Wolverhampton, and I'm joined today by my colleague Dr. Spencer Jones. In this episode, we'll be discussing the video game Call of Duty World at War, and we'll be considering how accurately it portrays and depicts the Second World War. So, Spencer, to get us started, why are we making a podcast about this video game?
So we're making a video game podcast because nowadays, in the 21st century, the video games are such a gateway to military history. I make a case that I think most people, especially young people, get their first exposure to popular military history actually through video games rather than through other media such as TV and film. And in fact, as a result of this change in how people approach military history, we've actually recently introduced a popular culture and war module for the War Studies undergraduate degree at the University of Wolverhampton, and our research and our work for that, preparing that module, has actually informed what we're going to be talking about today, of course.
Indeed, yeah, and it's something that we also do on the various MA programs that we run as well. So we have an MA program on the First World War and one on the Second World War as well. And so we certainly engage with the ideas of sort of memory and how these two conflicts are depicted in sort of popular media on both of those MAs. So this is something that we certainly look at a lot at the University of Wolverhampton. And so we thought it'd be interesting as well to make a podcast about it and for a sort of wider audience. Also, I mean, I think the other thing I should say as well, I play computer games quite a lot myself, so it's kind of a real interest of mine as well. So it's not just sort of for something I do for my job; it's something I do as a hobby as well. I think that's the same for you as well, Spencer.
Absolutely, it is. One of my great joys in life is video games. They have been since I was old enough to go to the first arcades. They still are now. And in fact, in preparation for this podcast about Call of Duty World at War, I dug out an old console, an Xbox 360. I've still got a copy. My old physical copy of Call of Duty World at War. It still works. I actually played the whole campaign just so we could have the freshness of it in my mind for this podcast.
Yeah, same here. I was I think up until about 1 o'clock this morning, just finishing off, getting the Nazis in the Reichstag.
Yeah. Well, my living room was echoing with the sounds of battle all week. That's for sure.
So I think before we dive into sort of discussion, or more detailed discussion of the game, I thought we should give the sort of the listeners a bit of an overview of it in case they've not played it before. So the game is part of the Call of Duty series, or the Call of Duty franchise, and it was the fifth game that came out as part of that, and it comes out in November 2008. And the game has sort of multiple modes. The main one that we're going to be talking about today is the solo campaign, or the sort of first person sort of solo campaign. And this kind of has two main stories within it. So there's the one campaign where you play as an American soldier in the Pacific Theatre, and then there's another one where you play as a Soviet Union or a member of the Soviet Union fighting on the Eastern Front. So that's kind of really what we're going to be focusing on today. But there are two other modes as well. So there's a multiplayer mode where players would sort of play against each other, so a sort of a PvP mode, and also a zombies mode, which we'll talk about a bit at the end. It's kind of like a PvE, so player versus enemies mode. Also, we should mention as well that the game is sort of quite generally well received, I think it's fair to say, by the audience and also critics when it was released, and still I think has that good reputation. And also it was quite a large commercial success. So in the US, it sold about 3 million copies in the months, I think in the 2 months after its release. And as of sort of 10 years later, so November 2013, it has sold 15.7 million copies. So by picking this game, we're not picking some obscure title that's depicting war to a very small number of people. We're picking here one sort of major cultural artifact, which is portraying war to a very large population, and not just an American population, but I think one sort of a more global one than that. So then, if we sort of dive straight into the content then. So, Spencer, in your view, how accurate is this game? So, let's say depiction of the Eastern Front. If we sort of go there first, what do you think?
So just before I get into this, I think it's worth establishing that there was a long pantheon of Second World War FPS shooting games. It was beginning with the Medal of Honor series, a fancy version of a Second World War FPS, and one of my personal favourites, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and even before then, of course, Wolfenstein. There was quite a long tradition of first-person shooters in the Second World War, but they nearly always focused on the American experience in the West. And from Normandy onwards, essentially. And so by rooting it in the Pacific, which I believe, and I stand to be corrected, but I believe this is the first time there'd been a major FPS set in the Pacific. and also rooting it in the Russian, the Eastern Front, the game got to sort of play with some slightly different themes. That these were not well-worn themes in the way that, say, Normandy was. And perhaps in a future iteration, we might look at how Omaha Beach has been portrayed and portrayed and portrayed again in video games. So, in terms of historical accuracy, one thing I'd say is this is cinematic accuracy. Just like all war cinema or war media, everything's condensed. So, of course, everything happens much faster than it does in real life. Everything's much shorter range than it is in real life. Everything's much more intense, more colourful. And I think with video games, of course, a principle of good video game design is you've got to give the players something to do. You've always got to have something for them to do, for them to engage with. And so in these games, apart from relatively short cutscenes, you're always shooting, you're always fighting, you're always doing something. But I thought and this is true in fact of the Call of Duty games, particularly from Call of Duty 4, which is Modern Warfare, you've got a cinematic element in that you're not just a player in the game, you're not just a soldier in the game, you're actually a character in a film. And I think the fact that you've got two very big name actors, Kiefer Sutherland and Gary Oldman, is actually a really sort of adds to this feel that you're not necessarily in the Second World War, but you're in a cinema version of the Second World War, or even a superhero version of it, because your character's basically superhuman. It takes astonishing amounts of damage, and all that happens is the screen goes red. So in that, we have to remember it's coming from that sense. This isn't attempting to simulate the Second World War. And within that means you've got some slight oddities. There's an awful lot of tanks getting extremely close to infantry. The way tanks drive, they're extremely fast and mobile, and you do have those opportunities occasionally against tanks in the PvP mode and so on and so forth. Your character's always at the centre of the action. They're never playing a supporting role. But one thing that I know you picked up, Adam, which I think is really interesting, is particularly the links between the Soviet campaign and the film Enemy at the Gates. And I wasn't aware of this, and it was only when you told me before I played the game, I was like, oh, really? And then I played it this week and thought, blimey, Adam was right.
Yeah, I think they definitely are. And I think also we can sort of see links with both campaigns to other forms of media, so particularly film and television here. So as you mentioned, so Enemy at the Gates, so the Soviet campaign, we're kind of introduced to the character in amongst a load of bodies in Stalingrad, so very much reminiscent of the film, the scene in Enemy at the Gates, where there's this, clearly a massacre has taken place, or at least large numbers of Soviet soldiers have been killed, and the Germans are moving through, sort of finishing people off, and that's how the game starts. And I think the mission's called Vendetta as well, which kind of sets up one of the central themes, certainly of the Soviet campaign going forwards. So yeah, certainly. So that's that from the film. Also, I think there's sort of various other kind of sort of nods or influences here. So the colour scheme is very interesting as well. It's very desaturated. I don't know if it's something you noticed. And I think on one level that's partly because of the that kind of era of video games. They're all pretty brown. I think it's fair to say most games coming out in that period are. But also, I think if you think about like Saving Private Ryan, but particularly sort of Band of Brothers as well, which I think clearly influences on this game, that they were desaturated as well on purpose. The colours there were desaturated. I believe I'm right in saying that sort of Steven Spielberg sort of said that one of the reasons he had done this is to try and make what's being portrayed on screen look more like the footage that was taken at the time, the kind of desaturated kind of newsreel footage that we see. And also as well, I think with World at War as well, it does of course use quite a lot of original footage in the kind of the intros, as it were, to the various missions. And so I think we can see that this idea of sort of realism or an attempted authenticity by kind of capturing that aesthetic is sort of writ quite large there, because it's like using that footage directly in the game as well. So yeah, I very much think that this game is being sort of heavily impacted by other media. One thing I would sort of pick up on is actually we do see the Pacific Theatre feature in some earlier video games. So for example, there are 2 Medal of Honor games which come out prior to this set in the Pacific Theatre.
Yes.
So there's Medal of Honor Rising Sun 2003, which I must admit I've not played, but looked it up, and it's very much you're the kind of the secret agent. Approach to telling stories about the Second World War. So I think the game starts with you're at Pearl Harbor as a member of the US Marine Corps for some reason, but then you're sort of doing all these missions behind enemy lines and all this kind of stuff. So it's sort of, it doesn't really necessarily have to be set in the Pacific. It's just Pacific themed. But the second one is Medal of Honor Pacific Assault. That's 2004. So 4 years before this.
Now I did play Pacific Assault. Oh. Yeah, how had that gone out of my memory?
And
advancing years.
This does cover, I think, sort of quite a few sort of similar story beats in the sense of like quite a few of the sort of islands that you play on, or you attack as the American character in both games is the same. So there's Peleliu and Macon Island feature in both games. So it is, I think, tonally it's quite different, but is I think it's not fair to say it's the first time we see it depicted on screen. And the other one I would mention as well is I can't remember when this came out, but Battlefield 1942 as well. It's not.
Yes.
It's not a story-driven game. It's a multiplayer only, although you could play it as a single player against bots. And that has multiple Pacific Theatre sort of maps, I suppose you call them, in it as well. But I think that the big point you're making there is 100% correct. The majority of the Second World War up to that point, how it's been depicted in video games up to that point, is the Americans on the Western Front post D-Day or D-Day and post centric, I think it's fair to say. And obviously Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers are sort of central, I think, in sort of shaping the narratives and stories that are told there, I think. It's fair to say. So we talked a bit about sort of both sort of campaigns there. I think maybe if we say sort of focus a bit more on the Eastern sort of Front campaign then, what would you say is sort of some of the sort of major themes that sort of run throughout that campaign, Spencer?
This was really interesting to play because, of course, it's now 15 years old, this game. And video game design and storytelling has changed and it's evolved. Video game story design is, of course, a subject in itself. And playing this game, I was struck by one. You could feel it was an older form of storytelling. It was very much rooted in cinematic storytelling and so forth. And it's painting with an extremely broad brush. And this isn't a criticism, by the way. It's just that's the way the story it tells. So the story of the Eastern Front is one of extreme violence, and as you say, the first mission is vendetta, and it's all about death and destruction and brutality, and the cruelty of the Eastern Front. Now, of course, that is a genuine feature of the Eastern Front. Extreme violence, a war perhaps beyond political control, extreme casualties. But it's quite interesting that it invites you to participate in this extreme violence and be involved in it and perhaps enjoy it almost vicariously without ever questioning, well, why is this so extremely violent? What's driving this? And that, for me, as a historian, I think, well, okay, so it's playing on this. It's playing on the fact that the Eastern Front is exceptionally violent. But if you were just somebody coming to this with very limited knowledge, I think it hits a lot of cliches of the Eastern Front about the extreme violence, the prolific use of troops by the Soviets, the cruelty of both sides, the violence of it. And in that sense, of course, it's plugging into one of those things that, in inverted commas, everybody knows about the Second World War. The Eastern Front's terrible, it's violent, there's massacres and brutality. But what is quite interesting for me is that you're invited to be part of this, and I think you're invited to enjoy it. I don't think the game raises any moral questions about whether what the characters are doing is right or wrong. You might make a case to say, if you were being really specific, and I don't believe this for a minute, you could say, well, it's talking about the brutality of war and the characters you are brutalized by war. But I don't think it's telling that story. There's other games that have told that story, and this isn't one. This is a story about tough people who've had bad things done to them go and kill everybody. It's sort of a spaghetti western style approach to the violence of war in that sense. Now, as entertainment, there's a great case to be made for it. But in terms of realism, I think there's questions to be raised. Now, one of the things, of course, World at War marks itself as when it was coming out is this is going to be it's going to be more realistic. It's going to be more realistic than ever before. It was coming on the back of Call of Duty 4, where, of course, you'd had the remarkable scene where you're killed by a nuclear blast, which I think is definitely the first time you've had an FPS where your character dies of radiation poisoning. And it had been a little bit Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan, James Bond, and we're getting back to sort of the basic grit of war. But it's interesting to me that I think this game, and indeed the games that followed it, more than others, they believe that realism in this sense has to mean extreme violence. And one of the things that was marketed, in fact, was flames now burn people more realistically. There is limb removal. Soldiers can have limbs blown off and lie there screaming. And that this was being marketed as, oh, it's realistic. Don't you want to be involved in this? That's very odd to me. And that's very. I found that this very odd, because there's no sort of moral question about this. There's no point where, as has appeared in some other games, where your character looks at the horror of war and thinks this is terrible. Instead, you're just invited to get involved in this destruction and enjoy it. And I don't think there's any kind of deeper meaning to it. I just think it's to do with that. And this for me is a very interesting point about World at War, and indeed a lot of games, a lot of first-person games in this period, that realism just means more violence rather than more realistic portrayals of war. Because if it was realistic portrayal of war, lots of people would waste lots of ammunition into the air. A portion of people probably wouldn't even fire their guns if SLA marshals to be believed. Tanks would break down. Most of the time you'd spend digging holes or sitting around or writing letters or being bored. And so realism in this sense, why does it always mean more violence? What do you think about that, Adam?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think on one level, it's the nature of the medium in the sense of at its core, it's got to be entertaining in some fashion, or at least sort of hold the players' sort of attention. So, as you say, the whole notion of war being 10% terror, 90% boredom, I think probably wouldn't make for a top 10 game. I think it's fair to say. On that sort of thought about, particularly if we sort of focus on the Soviet campaign, about how it's sort of portraying sort of the morality or how it sort of depicts the kind of the atrocities which are being committed by. Initially, it's kind of more the Germans doing it in the Stalingrad, and then, of course, it's very much the Soviet Union troops doing it in the latter missions. I think it's quite mixed, I thought, in the sense of I think the game is quite confused in terms of what message it's trying to send. Because there is actually alternative endings of that campaign, the Russian campaign, depending on what your actions are in earlier parts of it. So there are 3 points in the Soviet campaign. So there's the first one is when you're in the Stalingrad mission. So when you shoot the German general, then what you do next? Do you use your sniper rifle to protect the Soviet troops who are being attacked, or do you ignore them as Reznov, the Gary Oldman character, tells you to? And that sort of like kind of counts as a moral decision. The other one is regarding, so it's in the first mission where you are attacking. You've kind of come back in 1945. It's the Silo Heights mission, I think, where you're sort of saved once again, because this is a reoccurring theme throughout the game. The idea of the player being put in a powerless situation where you're held captive by the enemies. It happens 3 times, and I think it's the last one of those where the sort of Germans are beating you up and then you are rescued at the last minute. Reznov, or the Soviet soldiers injure all the Germans around you, but then you're invited to finish them off. And then it depends how you react on that. That's a moral choice, because the game counts what you do there. And the last one is there's a couple of German soldiers who are trying to escape, but then get caught in a sort of subway in front of some subway gates, and then you're invited to finish them off, or your comrades will. And depending on how you act in those events, it shapes. There's some narrative right at the very beginning of the final mission, the one where you put the flag on the Reichstag, because there's a character, a Private Chernov or something like that, and it's established that he has a notebook and he's writing in it about you, basically. And what he says about you depends on what you've done in those 3 sort of settings. So if you've, as you were saying, lent into the brutality and sort of killed all the Germans, ignored your Soviet soldiers and been profligate with their lives to make sure you got the German, killed the guys in the subway, he says, I made a note of this because I thought it was really interesting. He says that your brutality, and he calls you a savage, interestingly as well. Because when we talk about how the Japanese are portrayed later on, that phrase has become quite interesting there. Whereas if you don't do anything, and so you sort of step back and don't partake in this kind of like extreme violence, he says that you showed mercy and are a hero. And he only uses the phrase hero if you do all the sort of don't participate in it. But there's also a third option where if you do some of the violent stuff, or some of the sort of decisions, and don't do others, he says, I don't understand the man. Sometimes he's really violent, other times he's not. So there isn't fascinating. So there is an attempt to have that in the game, but it's super light touch. As you have to play the game multiple times to spot it. I think it's fair to say.
I'm obviously a goody two shoes because I played it twice, 15 years ago, and then just this last week, and I got the nice ending because I thought, I'm a goody two shoes. I'm not going to burn these Germans to death, or I'm going to protect my own troops. So I always did the goody two shoes option, and I didn't realise that if you did it violently, you got a different ending. So I've actually learned something about the game there.
Yeah, I won't tell you which ending I got because that says too much about me. But yeah, there's also, which we can talk about later on, there's also one for the Pacific Theatre as well. There's alternative, it's not quite as developed as in the Soviet campaign, but there is alternative endings there as well. But the core point we're sort of driving at here is its depiction of these atrocities and your engagement with them as a player. So is that, I think, because there's that sort of multiple ending stuff, there is a veneer of it sort of maybe not, let's say, being sort of true, to coin a phrase, warsploitation, as perhaps some of the later Call of Duty games become. But I think that's only quite a fine veneer. Because I think when you sort of look at some of the other artistic choices which are being made as the game is played, so particularly when you're in the Reichstag right at the end, where it's clearly the war is over, clearly you're killing a load of people who are, just fighting for their lives at this point, the game's up, as it were. The music that's being played is like, guitar riffs, kind of, power guitar music.
It's rocking out. I was enjoying that part of the music, I have to say, blasting through the Reichstag with power riffs playing.
So I think that sort of sense, kind of like, at the very least, if we're being most charitable, we could say kind of a mixed message, because you're sort of like, sort of killing, people who are essentially powerless to stop it. It's very interesting placing the player in a very unusual position, because for most Call of Duty games there had been levels, or indeed like core sort of like parts of the story, where you'd been sort of the people making the last stand, whereas in this game it's the other way around. You're the people inflicting the last stand on other people, which is very interesting in itself.
That is interesting, and you're absolutely right. That you in other Call of Duty games, it's often the last stand in some way, shape, or form. One of my absolute favourite Call of Duty missions of all time, Call of Duty 4, where you're in with the SAS team, you've been rumbled, and there's this big heavy armoured attack comes in on you, and you have to fight back step by step by step. I remember that was really good. But geez, this is where you are. It is almost a power fantasy. You're absolutely ploughing through the Reichstag. You should be really gunning down sort of French Charlemagne SS and Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm. But it's interesting, though, about that there is an attempt to morally engage at least a little bit, which speaks perhaps a little bit more. Perhaps I was a little bit harsh to sort of judge it and say there's no moral engagement. But again, I think it does speak a little bit about realism here, because I imagine perhaps even some people watching this video might think, well, realism means the gun has exactly the right amount of material on it, the tanks are exactly the right, they've sampled the right kind of gun sound, there's enough, all that kind of realism in the sense of material accuracy. But of course, as historians, we know that realism also is about a lot more about social attitudes as well, about cultural approaches to this. And in this sense, do we feel that this is a realistic cultural portrayal of this period of the war?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think a distinction can be drawn here between, I think, what's often referred to in literature as authenticity versus realism, or at least authenticity being a sub part of realism, and they're not the same thing. And so authenticity tends to be more closely connected with the aesthetic, the space, and so is to do with the kind of, what kit they have, are they in the right place at the right time? Stuff. Whereas the realism touches onto what you're sort of driving at, I think, with your question here about the cultural context. Are the characters acting in a kind of a way that they might at the time? Is it invoking the emotions that it's aiming for, or what may have been experienced by people at the time? And I think certainly on the authenticity side of things, it's certainly trying to get some things sort of right, but is sort of quite loose in some of it. So I mean, you can get proper sort of rivet counting. So like I did notice this, I made a little note when I was playing it, that in the Stalingrad mission, there's a burnt out King Tiger 2. So,
yes, I spotted that too. Yes, teleported through time back to Stalingrad. Yes. Clearly.
So there's little things like that, which I mean, in the grand scheme of things, don't really affect anything. But I think for the most part, it's attempting to be somewhat authentic in that sense. But in terms of realism, I mean, there's this kind of the broader kind of. I think can video games ever truly be realistic? Because at the end of the day, you can just reload a save if you get killed, which is not really possible in real life. And also even down to like in the Pacific campaign, what your guy can carry. So it's like a Browning machine gun with like 400 rounds of ammunition and a flamethrower. Like no, I don't. The Marines know that very strong. So some of the sort of realism stuff does sort of push sort of credibility in that regard. But I think it does quite a good job of sort of trying to depict the Soviet sort of will for revenge. I think that's sort of like a kind of a key motif that comes through here. And I mean, maybe this is giving the game too much credit, but I think what it does, I mean, maybe this is reaching a bit hard, but what it does do, I think quite interesting, is or always has a go at portraying the duality of war, or at least duality of people's experience of war. So it's sort of similar set of ideas that Edmund Blunden explores in his book Undertones of War, his memoir Undertones of War. This idea that war brings out the worst in people. So killing, killing, and particularly killing people you've never met for, because you're told to do it, but also at the same time, like sacrificing, this idea of like on the other side of things, people, bringing out the best in people, sacrificing themselves for what they perceive to be at least the greater good, and also sacrificing themselves for their friends, because that motif does come into the game as well, particularly in the Pacific theatre from the American side of things. So I think the game does try to sort of tap into perhaps a more, I don't know, I won't say realistic, but like a greater sort of range of emotions that are sort of present in war than you often get with games which are sort of claiming to be anti-war, or other forms of media which claim to be anti-war. I think there is a bit more sort of nuance that's going on. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about duality of war, because and perhaps if we do further podcasts on this, that there's some of my favourite games which are involved with war as a background have played on this duality. I'm thinking particularly the Japanese Ace Combat series, which has some really complex messages about the duality of war, the sacrifices, the heroism, and so on and so forth. And in this as a Call of Duty game, I think there's a noticeable difference between the mood in Call of Duty 4 and this one, because that's obviously a design decision. So Call of Duty 4, you're a SAS man or you're a US Marine, and you're fighting out-and-out terrorists. And this is, of course, in the height of the Great War on Terror when that game came out. What's worse than a terrorist? Well, probably nothing in the Western military mind at that time. Whereas when you come into World at War, there is a bit more complexity. The war's obviously on a much larger scale. You're not just a small special forces group behind enemy lines anymore. Now you're in a war, and that duality of it, and the fact that as you say, as Blunden says, there's best and worst in humanity in war. The cruelty, the violence, the wanton destruction, combined with the willingness to sacrifice yourself for a cause that may be nebulous, and your comrades, who of course have become your substitute family. Perhaps we're giving the game too much credit, or I might put it another way and say perhaps it's impossible to really portray war without even subconsciously becoming involved in this duality. Perhaps it is an eternal feature of war. And of course, writers other than Blunden have touched on this, even if they haven't used the same language. We could go all the way back to the Iliad, which touches on sacrifice and the loss of loved ones effectively, as well as courage and extreme violence. So perhaps that is the essence of war, and whether it may not have been a direct design decision to do this, but perhaps Call of Duty captures that.
I think so. I mean, I think it does sort of fumble a little bit with some of these themes, so I don't want to sort of read too much into it. So I think for example, one of the sort of examples where it is perhaps giving mixed messages, or at the very least is sort of pulling its punches to some degree, is when it's portraying an Allied force committing war crimes, essentially. It is, of course, the Soviets it gives that role to. I don't think we see American troops in this committing war crimes unless you include like the use of the flamethrower, but that's kind of you're not being asked to shoot down surrendering Japanese soldiers in the way that you are when you're playing as the Soviet Union. So you can say it's pulling its punches a little bit when it talks about that as well. And also as well, I mean, there is a whole you are killing Nazis, and so I think there's such a thing as a universal baddie that's not a zombie; it's a Nazi. And then later on, of course, we'll talk about Nazi zombies later on. There's sort of two levels of acceptability when it comes to sort of mowing people down. So you can say on one level the game is pulling its punches a little bit there, in the sense of it could have sharpened that point a little bit further by putting you in the shoes of the American character being sort of put in a position where they can commit atrocities or not. Because of course we know that certainly happened in the Pacific theatre, and it certainly sanitizes the American involvement. The involvement of American soldiers in atrocities in the Pacific theatre quite clearly. So yeah, I think so. I mean, also, the other sort of point on this as well, which I think is particularly interesting, is the final mission of the game is out of chronological order. Because the final mission of the game, of course, is the flag on top of the Reichstag, whereas the Okinawa missions happen before that, but chronologically they are afterward. Yes. And so it's deliberately ending the game on the Soviet Union, replacing essentially the Germans, right, the Nazis, I should say. So it's quite morally ambivalent in the sense of it's one regime which is not exactly renowned for its human rights record, replacing another which is the same, right? So I think that's done on purpose as well, because why else would you make them out of chronological order?
That's an interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, but you're absolutely right. Of course, it is out of chronological order, and just to go back to the Japanese side as well, one of the things that's quite striking is it does get across Japanese brutality, which is well attested to in the Pacific. You start the game being tortured, which would become quite a common thing actually in Call of Duty. There's an awful lot of getting tortured in the latest Call of Duty games. I wonder where the ideas for that are coming from. But you start getting tortured by this basically hideous Japanese officer or Japanese figure. Japanese are portrayed as brutal and cruel, and it's sort of chiming into the same kind of messages it's portraying on the Eastern Front. But as you say, you're not invited to. Do you want to machine gun these Japanese or burn them with a flamethrower? And instead, it all takes place in terms of legitimate combat, and that's an interesting design decision because it's almost sort of. I don't know, it's sort of saying, well, that the American war was a bit morally cleaner than the Russian war, even though the enemy was just as ferocious and vicious. But I agree with you about the decision to end it with the Reichstag rather than, say, end it with an Okinawa, or even end it with an atomic bomb sequence. Call of Duty 4 had the nuclear explosion sequence. Is perhaps because the Reichstag ending is the ultimate evil is crushed. Nazis are the ultimate evil. They must be annihilated. Whereas Japan, Imperial Japan, is not morally ambiguous. It's dreadful empire in the Second World War that deserves to be defeated. But it's portraying a sort of different approach, and there's a different idea about how the war ends. And it's almost as if the war ends when Okinawa's conquered. I thought that it sort of gives you that message. Well, Japan's defeated now, and that's it. Let's go back to the Reichstag and deal with the Nazis. Just an interesting. I suppose it would be difficult to portray the actual end of the war in an entertaining game-playing way. Perhaps there wasn't a desire to redo the atomic to do a nuclear sequence, given it was so famed in the first Call of Duty 4 and things, but an interesting approach to the narrative storytelling, I think.
I think so. I think also on this idea of the game pulling its punches, perhaps a little bit in terms of exploring these themes, which it could have taken farther. You only ever play as one of the allies. It could put you in the shoes of the Germans. That was totally within the realms of possibility. It could have done that if it was trying to explore these themes a little bit. So, and also, in the multiplayer, you can play as the Germans, so it's not like there's some, all the Japanese, right? So, they could have done that, and they choose not to, which I think is an interesting choice in and of itself. Because, even if the game wanted to sort of call back to the atomic bomb scene, which you mentioned in the game immediately prior to this, so Call of Duty 4, you could have been a Japanese person in Hiroshima, say, and that would have been quite an ending for the game, right? If you're trying to make these big points. Whereas I think, the game maybe is a little bit, but is really pulling its punches. It could go farther. And also, I think the other interesting sort of theme here as well is that I think to a certain extent the Nazis receive way more humanization in this game than the Japanese do. So you see quite a few Germans attempting to surrender and then are killed, and they're calling out for help and mercy and all the rest of it. But you never see the Japanese do that, except in one scene. If you know what I'm talking about, right at the end, when the Japanese go to fake a surrender, and that's where the dual endings occur. So you get to choose who survives, because there's Sergeant Roebuck, who's voiced by Kiefer Sutherland, or the other is like Private Polonsky or something like that, and you can choose which one of them survives by which of the Japanese fake surrendering soldiers do you shoot. So I think that's an interesting message as well. So this sort of theme of surrender and powerlessness is a very an interesting one for how it appears throughout the game, especially as well. I think this sort of point is made even starker because it's in the final American mission. This occurs, this sort of fake surrender by the Japanese, and then of course it sets up the kind of the final kind of pre-credit sequence, which of course includes footage of the atomic bomb being dropped, and it maybe sort of hints into this idea of was the atomic bomb necessary to a drop? Will the Japanese going to surrender without it? And of course, there is a very large historiographical debate, I think it's fair to say, regarding this issue. But it's pretty clear, I think, where the game sits on this, right? The Japanese are only faking surrender. They're not going to surrender. And so, atomic bomb is the result, I think. That's
a very interesting point. Interesting contrasts about the Russians and the Germans and the Japanese in this. And one thing I sort of just like to draw on a little bit as well with this is of course when the game is released. So it comes out in 2008. The war on terror is at its height. You've got the surge in Iraq, which has seemingly turned the tide of war. Afghanistan's starting to heat up as well. The war on terror has been going on for 7 years by this stage. Everybody's seen the violence in Iraq, especially between 2004 and 2007. And there's I think I don't know because I'm not a I'm not an expert in the cultural zeitgeist in this period, but a desire or a belief that the America's enemies were the most ruthless, despicable people you could possibly meet, and that you can't trust them. You have to destroy them. You have to destroy them completely. Plays a little bit into this game. It's interesting that, as I said earlier, the realism aspect is the extreme violence, limb removal, mutilated soldiers screaming, and that's billed as this is the most realistic Call of Duty ever. Not because of any differences in how it's portrayed on it, but because the violence is even more extreme. And this is perhaps a time when perhaps Western audiences are a bit more, or have got that desire for to see war portrayed in this way. I may be taking this too far, but it just struck me, that this is when this comes out, the context of when it comes out, and of course where the Call of Duty series goes from this point, because the next game is Black Ops, which is a fun game. For listeners, I played all the Call of Duty games. Don't judge me. I enjoy first-person shooters. And Black Ops' moral message is absolutely really strange, and indeed the Black Ops sort of series really leans into this, that it's absolutely fine for CIA agents to commit crimes, torture, destruction, overthrow of legitimate governments as long as it protects America. I suppose if you were reading it very subtly, you might say, well, there's some veiled criticism of this, but it's pretty darn veiled. Otherwise, that the message is, tough American males have to go and destroy things that the soft US government won't deal with, and that's a very much a war on terror message. And although this is set in the Second World War, it is made in this period, and I do feel there's a little bit of a hangover in why the emphasis is on violence and destruction and carnage rather than anything else in terms of realism.
Yeah, I definitely see what you mean. And of course, we should say that, the Black Ops 1, as it becomes kind of retrospectively, because there's obviously multiple games which are called Black Ops in this series.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. It's, of course, I suppose you could say it's a direct, well, maybe not direct, it's certainly a sequel to this game, because it features Reznov, the Gary Oldman character, features in Black Ops 1. Obviously, it's a bit of a spoiler. Does he really feature?
Spoiler if you've not played this 15-year-old game,
yes. So I mean, I suppose we could say maybe some of the sort of same themes are sort of creeping across between the two, in the sense of like, I know it's a bit of a cliche, you have to get your hands dirty to keep the world clean, sort of set of ideas, because I mean that's certainly being explored here, I think, even with the Reznov character, maybe to a degree.
Yes,
interestingly as well, that the Reznov character in the World at War, he is the one always shouting out essentially propaganda, the idea of sacrifice for the greater good, whereas the American characters never do that. Like the Sergeant Roebuck Marines, he never refers to, like, I don't think, America more broadly, which is an interesting idea.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that it's the the communist character, the Soviet character that comes back and is essentially doing the same sort of thing, but in the second game, this idea of like getting their hands dirty for the greater good, whereas that's not how the Americans are being framed in this game, the World at War game. So it's interesting where this game sits in this sort of like the grand scheme of the Call of Duty kind of depiction of war. Because I suppose it speaks to this sort of larger issue. Like Call of Duty 4, I think. I'd be interested to see if you agree with this. I think its tone is kind of anti-war. I think it's fair to say Call of Duty 4. What would you say about this game? Would you say this game is anti-war?
It's a good question. So, just full disclosure, Call of Duty 4 is one of my all-time favourite games. It was actually the first game I ever got every single achievement on, which took a long time, a lot of hard work. So I love Call of Duty 4. And one of the reasons I loved it was I thought the story was much more nuanced and complex than most FPSs. Most FPSs, up to that point, put you in the shoes of an American soldier, nearly always an American soldier, and say, go and be heroic, and you would, and there'd be intense fighting, but you'd always win. And whereas Call of Duty 4 raised some moral ambiguity about what are you doing, that there was fascinatingly ambiguous characters. Captain Price of the SAS, surely an iconic figure, and of course, one of the interesting things about Call of Duty 4 is that the direct sequel, Modern Warfare 2, it's actually, you've lost. That the Special Forces are defeated effectively at the end of Call of Duty 4. Well, not defeated, but the war doesn't go according to plan. Russian ultranationalists take over Russia. So I think Call of Duty 4 was starting to play with the ambiguities a little bit. But I actually found playing World at War, certainly just this last week, I didn't really feel any of that. I felt this was a much more in some ways, it's a conventional, albeit very violent portrayal of the Second World War. In that, yes, there are some moral choices. I didn't realise there was actually different endings until you've explained them, Adam. I knew with the Marines at the end, but I didn't know you could change the story a little bit with the Russians. But it's not ambiguous. What your characters are doing is not ambiguous. And possibly that's a little bit reflective of the Second World War. Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan clearly must be defeated. But do I find this a sort of has it got an anti-war message? I didn't think so. I think it may have an anti-combat message in the sense that combat's quite horrible. And if you step out of it for a moment and think, do I want to be in this kind of combat with people burning to death and with limbs flying everywhere? Well, unless you're a bit strange, you probably go, no, this is horrible. I don't want to be involved in this. But I don't think that it really plays up that explicitly anti-war message. Certainly not compared to other games that really emphasise that, which we could perhaps discuss in future episodes. But, and this is hand on heart time. So a little bit of a story first of all about how I came to World at War. A really good friend of mine at the time, he was a huge online gamer. I remember he said to me, "You've got to get World at War because it's got the zombies mode and it's amazing. You've got to play with me." I actually went and bought a hard copy from Electronics Boutique, which I don't think exists anymore. I should really show my age. When I played it through the first time, I remember my reaction. I remember I had quite a shocked reaction to the violence of the game. This is in context of 2008, the wound detail, the screams and so on. The invitation to kill surrendered troops. I don't think I'd ever seen it in a video game before, and I found that very striking. Now, I didn't know at the time you could get different endings either. Playing it through again, Goody Two-Shoesed it. It's interesting as well, the scene where you're actually invited, do you want to kill these troops? You're told you can machine gun them or you can burn them with Molotov cocktails. And if you don't do anything, they get burned anyway. So there's no way you can sort of say, hang on a minute, it might be good to ship these guys off to the cage. And I still had a bit of a moral reaction to it. It's been a long time since I played it and things. But I really enjoyed this game. I thought it's exciting. I think the missions are exciting. I think they're structured quite well. The action is intense. The intensity of battle does come with a thrill. The way the AI moves is very much Call of Duty. It's once you get to a certain point, basically the AI resets itself and things. So it's got its limitations in 2008, but I found it as a game compelling and enjoyable. And as somebody who's played all the solo aspects of Modern Warfare, it's one that I remembered quite fondly as a game. I haven't played it again as a game. I enjoyed it again. So for all this sort of analysis of its themes and things, perhaps the ultimate importance of this game is it's entertaining and it sold millions of copies. And even if we assume half of the people who bought it never went beyond a little bit of dabbling with the game, that's still millions of people who played and engaged with this message of the Second World War. And so it's a cultural artifact. It is influencing how Americans and the wider world perceive the Pacific theatre and the Russian theatre. But what do you think of the game, Adam? Do you enjoy it?
Yeah, I think I'd say I did, yeah. I mean, I think I came to it a little bit later. So I think my first Call of Duty game was Call of Duty 2, I think, which that must have been 2006, something around that, 2004, 2006. So a couple of years before this, and that was... you're the British, you're the Americans, and then also the Soviets in in that game, Call of Duty 2. And so it's much more, I think, vanilla in terms of its portrayal of the Second World War. It's very much, there's no war crimes being committed. I think it's fair to say in that one. So when I came to this one, it was a bit of a shock, I think, for me. Also, the sort of the depiction of the Pacific War that we talked about before. I must admit, I haven't played those two Pacific games that I mentioned. I haven't played them, and so this was certainly the first depiction for me. And I think we could say maybe the first depiction for most people, because I think the Medal of Honor games, they were more popular back in the day, but even then they weren't rivaling Call of Duty's sort of sales figures. So it's perhaps the first sort of like mainstream game, replication of it in a first-person story-based kind of setting, perhaps. So yeah, I did enjoy playing the game. I think it's fair to say, and I certainly, perhaps even more so, enjoyed thinking about it. Sort of, thinking about these themes and what the game is intentionally or unintentionally suggesting about, sort of the character of war, or sort of war, the morality of ideas associated with war. And sort of going back to sort of what you were saying earlier on about this, it struck me, Call of Duty 4, so the original Modern Warfare game, I think we can definitely say there's the sort of anti-war theme is pretty central to that, because it's kind of like what war is. Whereas any kind of anti-war messages in this game, so World at War, are much more to do with like how the war is played out, not the war in and of itself. So I think there's a distinction that can be drawn there, and I think you sort of hinted at or directly pointed to that when you said about it's anti-combat, and I think that's kind of what's happening here. It's sort of like what you do rather than sort of sort of how you do something rather than what you do, if that makes sense. And so I think that's perhaps the big kind of like tonal difference there.
That's yeah.
Also, I think one of the things that the game is somewhat subversive about here as well. It's like kind of, I think we sort of touched on this earlier on. Most sort of like games of this type are sort of power fantasies, and we certainly get that a lot as the war, from the Soviet side of things, as the war goes on, when you're very much in the sort of it's clear the Soviets aren't going to lose when they're in Berlin in 1945, and it's the Germans are running away, you'll be invited to shoot them as they're retreating, like burn the field that they're in, and all this kind of stuff. And at that point, the game stops putting you in a kind of like a powerless position, because prior to that, there'd been, say, as I mentioned earlier on, several instances where the player gets all kind of agency and power removed from them. This idea of being captured comes up 3 times, once in the American campaign and twice in the Russian. Prior to that time, or at least you having to lie still while the Germans move through that sort of that corpse field that we talked about at the very beginning. So the game is somewhat subversive in that, in the sense of it puts you in this sort of powerless positions where that isn't really what many sort of war games are sort of going for. So I think that's quite interesting there. So one of the other sort of things I would like to sort of highlight here as well is I think the game does tap into one of the other kind of major sort of like cornerstones of the certainly the British sort of cultural memory of the war in the Far East, and I think maybe also the American one as well, is the idea of sort of Allied soldiers as victims is a kind of a reoccurring theme. And of course, particularly when it comes to Allied soldiers as prisoners of war, is a reoccurring theme that we see certainly in the British sort of national memory of it. So that Bridge on the River Kwai being perhaps, maybe the most famous sort of war film set in the Second World War in the Far East, certainly from a British perspective. And I think it's notable that comes up repeatedly, these Allied soldiers as victims rather than as perpetrators, as they are in the in the Soviet campaign. So
that's
I don't know if you
interesting point, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed any sort of themes like that sort of running throughout the game, or any.
I didn't, because what I really tried to do was play it as a player. And say, coming at this not as a military historian or a lecturer, but just say, what does this feel like as a player? Not analysing the mechanics of it or so on, but just going into it and just say, okay, I'm a player. I don't know anything about these campaigns. What message does it come out? And the being captured and having your agency removed and powerlessness does come through quite strongly. And one thing I think it actually does, and this is something that lots of games now do this, where you remove your agency. In fact, there's even a lot of horror games trade on that idea that you as a player are suddenly rendered powerless. It's become such a common theme, I think, in horror games. It's almost become passé. And you've got games like Outlast, which extremely entertaining as it's basically you've got no power the entire game, and you're constantly being abused, physically abused and terrorized by horrible things. But at the time, within the sort of first-person shooters, it's as far as I know, it's quite rare. I mean, I draw comparisons to one of my all-time favorites, Return to Castle Wolfenstein, where you start off, you're actually being electrocuted by an evil Nazi scientist, and you just break free, you kick people, you get a gun, and you just blast your way out of this castle. It's absolutely pure empowerment. Whereas, in fact, the American campaign basically starts with you powerless and being tortured, and that's quite a bold narrative decision. And I think it really gets across the fact that it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the Japanese. That without ever saying that, it's without emphasizing the horrors of Allied prisoner of war camps, it gets across you don't want to be captured by Japanese soldiers. It's going to be awful for you, and that's definitely an undercurrent throughout this, and not necessarily inaccurate. Given the treatment of Allied prisoners of war, American, British, Australian, Indian, it's a theme, I think, but it's got across in a quite a subtle way. That for 2008, in the context of a pretty saturated FPS market, this is quite unusual, that repeatedly you are placed in a very vulnerable position, and you're not always given the opportunity. Sometimes you'll get rescued, of course, eventually. You don't die in that position, but it's not a case of you stab the captor and draw his gun and shoot 5 guys and blow up the base and escape, as it has been the sort of the tradition. So an interesting sort of approach, and if I'm riffing sort of deeper on this, the idea it gets across quite well, perhaps better than other Call of Duties up until this point, that you're a small cog in a very, very, very big machine, that you are just an individual soldier in a vast war. Whereas other Call of Duties have tended to emphasize elite squads, small squads that are doing very specialized things that are making a difference to the war, particularly in the Soviet camp. In the US campaign, there is an element of that with raiders and so on. But certainly in the Soviet campaign, you're just one guy in an army of millions fighting against another army of millions, and that it wasn't unique at the time. But I think that scale of it is an interesting theme that's well emphasized in this.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and that's the thing that really struck me, especially in relation to the previous offering, the modern COD 4 Modern Warfare, is that you're not some kind of elite specialist. I mean, I suppose you could say in the Marines you're one of the Marine Raiders. I suppose you could say maybe a little bit, but clearly, as you say, on the Soviet side of things, you're really not. Except there's that one level where you're as an ordinary private soldier, you're put in charge of a tank for some unknown reason.
Yeah.
So because you're meant to be playing as the same character still, it doesn't change it like it does when there's the Black Cats mission where you're in the PBY Catalina. It changes character. You're someone called Locke, but it for some reason in the end the Soviet campaign it doesn't change it, which I thought was an odd decision. But there we go.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's also interesting as well that in both instances they're silent protagonists as well, which is an interesting sort of decision, because usually the silent protagonist is so the player or the viewer, or in this case the player, can project themselves onto the character they are, whereas if you put sort of like words in their mouth, then that sort of changes the characterization. So I think that is an interesting sort of decision as well, sort of like trying to sort of maybe put the player into these kind of situations in a more kind of direct way than it perhaps could have done otherwise. But then again, maybe that's overreading it, because I think it's fair to say in the majority of Call of Duty games, if not all, you're always a silent protagonist. So maybe that's just a theme that runs throughout Call of Duty rather than them trying to make a broader point.
Yes.
I suppose one of the things that would be sort of good to talk about at this point is the zombies mode, because you mentioned it earlier on. And so what are your thoughts on this? How do you think, or does it sort of fit within the game tonally? Do you think it should have been included, or does it take away perhaps some of the weight of some of the themes that we've talked about so far?
So, full confession, I absolutely love horde shooters. My first exposure to a horde mode that I really enjoyed was the original Gears of War. So again, showing my absolute age there, I love the horde mode in that. I spent hours on horde mode with randos on the internet and friends. I've always enjoyed a good horde shooter, I still do. And the zombies mode is an interesting take on a horde shooter, especially in the context of 2008. Zombies were really hot as a zeitgeist concept in 2008, and they would be for years to come. You've got the Walking Dead comics. I can't remember when the Walking Dead TV series started. It feels like it was on for approximately 7 million years. And I say that as a big fan. In the end, even I was one of the Walking Dead. But zombies were really a hot sort of hot property, and to introduce them into Call of Duty, into a Call of Duty that's of course really based on what we're talking about, the grittiness, the violence of combat and so forth, is in some ways it's tonally completely weird, but it is a great fun horde shooter. And of course it's an unusual horde shooter in that you can't win. A lot of horde shooters will have certainly at that stage would have a culmination point where some kind of big bad boss appears, or there's a really intense wave, and then you finish and you calculate your scores. Ultimately you can't win Nazi zombies. It's a relentless. It leans into the horror element. They will just keep coming. They'll get stronger and stronger and stronger, and eventually you will all die, which is quite an unusual sort of way of playing it. What I also think is unusual is this Nazi Zombies mode spawned an entire separate franchise about Nazi zombies. The sniper games that I've just forgotten. I can't remember what they're called now. Sniper Elite then did its sort of zombie spin-offs, which actually are very fun games, I have to say, are highly enjoyable. But it's really interesting that why do they always have to be Nazi zombies? Why did they make them Nazi zombies, not Imperial Japanese zombies or Russian zombies? And if I have a criticism of this trope, it's that it turns the Nazis into cartoon characters. And this is something that has happened. Indiana Jones, of course, has the Nazis as the ultimate sort of comic book villains who get biffed and blown up. You've got Nazi zombies and things. But one thing that does, and I know I've sort of discussed this with students, and you may have done too, Adam, is it serves to diminish the realism of the evil of Nazism, and it reduces them to comic book ciphers. Just a Nazi is a bad thing. You should destroy it. And I think that can actually be, certainly in my experience as students, a barrier to understanding the real nature of Nazism and why it works and why it functions and the way it does and what it does. So that's an interesting thing. I think tonally it doesn't fit with the game at all. It's completely bizarre. But I spent a lot of time on the Call of Duty zombie mode. Just on that, and this is not to do with sort of the themes of the war, but I've never enjoyed the Call of Duty PvP modes. I've always preferred in FPS's team-based work, or with classes, with a little bit more. I don't want something like, what's that walking simulator that's extremely modern? Armour?
Yes, the Armour series, yeah. So
Armour series. I played that, and it just feels like walk 15 miles across an island and then get run over by a car. Holiday from hell. But I've always enjoyed a bit of tactics, a bit of squad-based, class-based, whereas Call of Duty's online component is very fast and furious with the kill streaks and all that kind of thing. But I always found it extremely unfulfilling. It was a bit like if you've got a box of soldiers and you just smash them all together and say, we're having a big fight. One thing I always find extremely funny in World of War's PvP is when you got through various kill streaks, one of the most dangerous kill streaks was unleash the dogs, and a bunch of killer dogs would appear and just savage the opposition team. Absolutely bizarre and completely bonkers in my opinion. But the zombie mode I really enjoyed, and of course it set a tone for horde shooter modes that became really popular. I mean, we've sort of, it's interesting, the development of horde shooter is moving in different directions now with things like Deep Rock Galactic or GTFO, where you've got one that's going a very horror theme and the other that's going more of a sort of creative theme, an exploratory game. But what Call of Duty Zombies, well, I was going to get the Call of Duty World at War anyway, but I got it faster because my friend wanted to play zombies. And I'd be ashamed to admit the amount of hours I spent on that zombie mode with various people. Occasionally being yelled and screamed at because I'd picked up the wrong gun or I'd bricked up the wrong wall or something. But that was the joys of Xbox gaming in the noughties. So
yes, yes, of being insulted by 12-year-olds. So
unbelievable. This is we're riffing a little bit, but there's a standing sort of internet meme now about Call of Duty lobbies, and that the modern generation wouldn't survive a Call of Duty lobby, and they were horrendous. Looking back, the racial abuse. I mean, it was the worst of the internet was in there, and it was usually being screamed at you by 12-year-olds from Liverpool or like Southern America or something, howling just a litany of foul language at you. And I often think, well, fast forward 15 years, they're sort of in their mid to late 20s now. They may have families, and I just think, wonder where it all went. I don't know. I don't know if online gaming's a friendlier place now or just as bad.
Well, yes, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? I mean, I suppose it fits into this larger discussion about how war is being portrayed and then how they're interacting with that. Because I guess it's not really sort of time for us to talk about this today, but if, as hopefully we can do sort of future sort of podcasts on video gaming, there's the idea of, does it make people more violent? Does it bring out the worst in people, being able to sort of express maybe some of our worst impulses in this way? And so that's something we can come back to, and maybe I'm not sure I would agree with this, but maybe that's a kind of a glimpse into the answer being yes, perhaps, the way that players are operating around it. But say that's a discussion for another day. But coming back to this idea of zombies and multiplayer, I mean, I must admit, I'm kind of the other way around. I really enjoyed the multiplayer aspect and didn't really play zombies much at all. Interestingly, I was the other way around. So certainly, I think the multiplayer aspect of a Call of Duty game that I played the most was the Modern Warfare 4. So the original Call of Duty 4, the original Modern Warfare. So I played that a lot. I dread to think how long, how many hours I invested. I wouldn't say wasted, invested in playing that. And so, I did play the modern the World at War multiplayer a fair bit, but I found it quite sort of bare bones. It's quite clearly it's just the game mechanics of the previous one, Call of Duty 4, just kind of given a World War II kind of lick of paint, as you say, because they couldn't have an attack helicopter. They have the dogs, and so it's sort of bringing it directly across like that. And so it did seem a little bit sort of lackluster in that regard. I thought, but I just did enjoy it. It was good to play with your mates for a little bit. But on the zombies, topic. I think it's a really interesting one because the way, because I tested this last night when I was playing it. If you finish the last level of the game, watch the cutscene and the credits roll, if you just leave it, then the zombies mode starts immediately afterward. It's not a separate thing that you have to go into, which struck me as sort of quite an interesting thing. Because I mean, is it like, what is it like? What do they call them? Like a stinger? That thing at the end of a Marvel film. They have,
yes.
Is it like that? Is it a cut? An extra scene added? Where is it meant to fit within the story? I guess that again, that's overreading it, but it's an interesting thought because you currently can project onto it some of the sort of themes that the game itself does explore, I think. And you can find some academics online writing about the Call of Duty's Call of Duty sort of Modern Warfare experience, and certainly the zombies mode as well. And I'm not sure I fully agree with this. I think it's the chap called Adam Campbell writes about this. He's an academic who writes on war in video games, and his argument was that, if I'm remembering correctly, that the zombies mode is sort of tapping into this idea of powerlessness, because as you said, you can never win. So there's that. It's also this idea of apocalypse as well. So you just have the nuclear blast, and then you get into zombies. So this idea of humanity being overthrown, and sort of the opposite of humanity. Again, I think this is maybe stretching and overreading a little bit, but it's interesting to think about. I think some of these ideas associated with it. But yeah, I think that I don't know. It's the game mode I probably enjoyed the least. I must say, but yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting choice, I would say. I mean, you could maybe see maybe this is the game that really kind of is the foundation of what COD became, or the first iteration of that. So it's the first game with zombies, the multiplayer, and the single player that we've been talking about, and also I think it's fair to say it's one of the shortest single player campaigns as well. And I think it's fair to say, as Call of Duty went on, the single player campaign contracted, and the main event became increasingly zombies and multiplayer. So I think maybe we can see it leaning that way from this point onwards. I would say.
Yes, and that's interesting as well. Perhaps we can cover other Call of Duties in the future, because, of course, thinking about Black Ops, of course, the sequel, Modern Warfare 2 with the famous No Russian sequence, which I believe led to it being banned in certain things. That the single-player game got increasingly dark and unpleasant, which in many ways perhaps reflective of the gaming zeitgeist at the time, but the multiplayer games just became huge. I know I had friends at the time who would play Call of Duty and they would never even play the single player game. They just booted up straight into the lobby and just get shooting at people. That was never me. I was always play the single player, then play some zombies, play a bit of the main game, just get killed constantly and have a kill death ratio of sort of 1 to 27, have everyone on the service call me an idiot and log out in shame. That Xbox 360 gaming in that era definitely got that feel, but that's a story for another day.
I mean, I think it's very interesting, this idea of people only buying the Modern Warfare, or so the Call of Duty games just to play the multiplayer, because it does touch into this sort of broader theme, and maybe in future podcasts we can explore this in more detail, is that the way in which war is depicted in games now increasingly seems to remove it from any kind of narrative. So like the war games which are very big now, such as World of Tanks, World of Warships, the War Zone, Call of Duty, any kind of multiplayer aspect to any of these games, even things like Hell Let Loose, which I play probably a bit too much of currently, they are kind of removing it all from a narrative. It's like, it's like going back to what I was saying earlier on, this idea of authenticity. So people are concerned about, does the tank have the right kind of gun? That kind of thing. Does the tank look correct? Whereas, what meaning is being projected onto these events? You kind of lose all that with this kind of the modern, or the most sort of like present gaming iterations of conflict, I think it's fair to say. And so I think we see perhaps the real, not the start of it here, but it's sort of a notable turn in this direction, with the zombies mode being another additional aspect to this. I would say. I suppose we're sort of coming toward the end of our time with this podcast. So are there any other sort of points you'd like to make regarding the game?
No. In fact, the only one I'd say is a sort of teaser for perhaps another episode. And I think that we've touched on this theme repeatedly, that this sets a tone that had perhaps begun in Call of Duty 4, but it is emphasised more in this. It'll be emphasised more in Black Ops and that whole Black Ops series. About the violence of war, and the fact that strong men doing bad things is necessary for world peace, and it produced one of my all-time favourite narrative FPSs, which is Spec Ops: The Line, in 4 years later in 2012, and I'd love us to come back and perhaps talk about that in the future, about portrayals of war. But one thing I would also say is certainly the students, undergraduate students who come onto the course, their experience, if you can say that, of war, their cultural experience of war is so driven by video games. It's an essential thing to study. And I think that the study of video games, though there is some very good work being done in that field, it lags hugely behind the study of film and literature for war. The study of video game war is relatively young, it's relatively new, even though video games been around for 40 years or so now. And that's one of the reasons we started the War and Popular Culture module at the University of Wolverhampton, to really dive into not just films and literature and art, but video games and how you participate in this and what the messages they send. So if you've enjoyed what we've been talking about and you think you'd like to learn a lot more about it, well, we've got the course for you.
We do indeed, yeah. So that's the War Studies undergraduate degree. So that's if you go onto the University of Wolverhampton's website and put in War Studies, you can find it that way. Also, our various MA programs to do. First World War and Second World War, we engage with some of these ideas as well. So Battlefield 1, for example, depicting the First World War. One of the things that we talk about there on the First World War program is that game's depiction of the conflict. So I think that kind of about sort of wraps up our podcast today. So as we kind of mentioned sort of throughout today's episode, we're hoping to do more podcasts like this in the future where we analyse a particular video game. So if you'd like to write in the comments, is there a game that you'd like to see us talk about? Because we certainly have a list of games that we want to talk about. But is there anything that you would like to hear us sort of wade in on? So put that in the comments if you have a game in mind. But I think we can leave it there for today's session, Spencer. It was great to talk to you, and it was also great for everyone to join us. And I hope to see them in the future. Right,
thank you very much, and we may even see you online. If you've got a particularly useless player on your team in a horde shooter mode, there's a slim chance it might be me.
or me.
Yeah.
Right. See you later, everyone. Thank you. Bye bye.